There is a truth that is very hard to accept, and precisely for that reason it is rarely stated plainly. A narcissist does not hold on to someone because of love, nor do they let someone go because love has ended. Those concepts belong to the emotional world of ordinary human beings, whereas narcissism operates through psychological structure. People often ask who the person is that a narcissist never forgets, then comfort themselves with familiar answers, the one they loved the most, the one who hurt them the deepest, the one they betrayed most cruelly, or the one they keep returning to after each new relationship collapses. But all of these explanations go in the wrong direction from the very beginning. Because a narcissist does not attach to people, they attach to a state of being. What they try to preserve is not a specific individual, but the sense of self they experienced while that person was still inside the system. It is a state in which they did not have to face their inner emptiness, did not have to self-regulate emotionally, did not have to touch the fragile ego they constantly avoid. Therefore, the person they never truly let go of is often not the one who stayed the longest, endured the most, or loved them the deepest, but the one who left while that structure was still unfinished, when the role had not yet been fully locked in, when psychological power had not yet stabilized. There is a kind of departure a narcissist cannot process. It is not leaving in tears, not leaving through arguments or confrontation, and not leaving to prove who was right or wrong. It is the kind of leaving that happens when you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop being there to regulate their emotions, and most importantly, stop carrying the emptiness they are incapable of facing themselves. When you withdraw in this way, you do not leave behind a clear emotional memory. You leave behind a gap in their psychological structure. That moment does not create longing in the usual sense, but it creates a fault in the system, a void that cannot be named, framed, or retold through the story they habitually use to protect the ego. And it is this void, not you as a person, that a narcissist can never truly release. Because you did not merely leave a relationship, you left a role that once kept their structure functioning. And when that role disappears, what remains is not regret, but an instability that cannot be named. Part 1. Narcissists do not attach to people, they attach to states. The greatest mistake people make when trying to understand a narcissist is using ordinary emotional language to explain a structure that does not operate through emotion. We are accustomed to thinking in terms of love, hate, remember, forget, so we assume that if a narcissist cannot let go of someone, that person must be special, must have been deeply loved, or must have left an exceptionally large emotional wound. But that model does not apply here. Narcissists do not remember people in the way you think. They do not miss you in an emotional sense. What they remember is the inner state they once had when you were still there. When you are inside a narcissist system, you are not merely a relationship. You are a functional component. Your presence gives them a very specific sensation, the sense of, I exist. Not existing as a whole human being, but existing as an ego that is reflected, validated, and seen through another person's gaze and reactions. While you were there, the narcissist did not have to ask who they were, did not have to face the inner void, because your presence was doing that work for them. The second state they attach to, no less important, is the feeling of having their emotions regulated from the outside. Narcissists cannot stably self-regulate their emotional system. They need another person to react, to care, to worry, to be angry, sad, or even hurt, so that they can locate themselves in relation to that response. When you react, they feel they have weight. When you remain silent but stay, they feel held. When you try to understand, to repair, to save the relationship, they feel powerful. All of this creates a familiar psychological state, distorted, but comfortable and safe for them. And the third state, also the most important one, is the feeling of not having to face emptiness. While you were still in the system, the narcissist did not have to look into the inner void. They did not have to touch the uncertainty, the inconsistency, or the sense of lacking a stable ego core. Through your presence and your role, you inadvertently shielded them from that confrontation. Therefore, what they attach to is not the memory of you as a person, but the memory of a time when that emptiness was kept out of sight. That is why the key statement here is not, they don't forget you, but rather this, they do not hold your image. They hold the way they once felt when you were still in the system. When you leave, what is lost is not love, but the state of inner power they relied on to exist. And it is precisely this loss that creates obsession, not longing in the ordinary sense. But one more point must be made clearly. Not everyone who once created that state becomes the one they never let go of. Most people who stay long enough are gradually replaced, blurred, or rewritten in the narcissist's narrative. The person who becomes an unerasable trace is the one who leaves before that state has time to stabilize, before the role is fully locked in, and before the structure has had time to self-adjust to their presence. And from this point, the story begins to move in a different direction, where the one they cannot let go of is no longer a matter of staying or loving more, but a matter of a disruption the narcissist can never repair. That is what we need to face directly in part 2. Part 2, the one they cannot let go of, the one who never stayed long enough. There is a truth that sounds paradoxical, yet it explains most of a narcissist's prolonged obsessions. They are not obsessed with those who stay. Those who stay the longest, endure the most, love deeply, and make great sacrifices are usually not the ones who leave an indelible trace. On the contrary, they are the easiest to metabolize within the system. When someone stays long enough, the narcissist has time to adapt, to adjust the power structure, to assign roles, to rewrite the story, and ultimately to establish control. Once the structure stabilizes, the specific individual becomes replaceable. The person a narcissist truly cannot let go of is the one who leaves too early. Not early in terms of time, but early in terms of structure, leaving before the persona has had time to fully form around that relationship. A narcissist needs time to construct an image of themselves in relation to you, a version of the persona suitable for exercising power, maintaining control, and pushing unwanted parts of themselves onto you. When you leave before that point, the process is interrupted. What must be understood is that this obsession does not arise because you were important or special in an emotional sense. A narcissist does not grieve you as an autonomous human being. What they cannot process is the fact that you were never fully framed. They did not have time to define who you were within their system, to assign you a familiar role such as savior, sufferer, wrongdoer, or stable supply. When the role has not yet been fixed and you are already gone, the system loses the anchor it needs to complete itself. Through a Jungian lens, this is the moment when the shadow is activated but not displaced. Normally, a narcissist uses others to carry the parts they cannot tolerate: insecurity, shame, emptiness, fragility. But when you leave before the projection process is complete, the shadow has nowhere to land. It does not return to dormancy, nor does it disappear. It remains suspended within the psychological structure, neither integrated nor expelled. What remains after such a departure is not longing, but a system error, an unresolved gap, a story that cannot be fully told, a state that cannot be recreated through another person. And because this error has no clear emotional form, the narcissist cannot mourn, cannot grieve in the way ordinary people do. They only register a persistent instability, a sense that something within their structure has shifted and cannot be repaired. From this point, we begin to touch a deeper layer of the issue. Because if the shadow is neither expelled nor integrated, the question is no longer, why are they obsessed, but where the shadow goes and what it does when it has no place to reside. This is when we must move deeper into the mechanism Jung described as the shadow's reversal back onto the subject, and that is precisely what will be opened in Part 3. Part 3. The shadow does not obsess over a person. It obsesses over a disruption, and when it has nowhere to discharge, it turns back onto the subject. To understand why a narcissist cannot let go in such a persistent and peculiar way, you must completely remove the emotional frame from your thinking. This has nothing to do with how much they loved you or did not love you. It has to do with this. You once functioned as a discharge mechanism for a psychological system that cannot self-regulate. In Jungian terms, the shadow is not simply evil. The shadow is everything that has been rejected from consciousness: fragility, shame, dependency, emptiness, envy, the longing to be loved, and even the feeling of, I have no value unless I am reflected. In a narcissist, the shadow is often compressed beneath the persona in an extreme way, because the persona is what allows them to survive. An image that is stable, strong, right, admirable, and self-sufficient. The problem is that the persona cannot stand on its own without a mirror. It requires constant external validation to maintain its form. For this reason, a relationship with a narcissist is not simply two people in love. It is an invisible contract. You provide reflection so the persona can exist, and in return, you are given the illusion that you are healing them, that your love has meaning, that you are special. But at a deeper level, what is actually happening is projection. The narcissist does not directly endure their own shadow. They expel it outward by making you carry it. When they feel insecure, they make you insecure. When they feel empty, they create drama so that you become dysregulated. And then they cling to that dysregulation as proof that I still have impact. When they feel shame, they devalue you so that shame becomes your fault. When they feel envy or inferiority, they provoke your reaction and then use that reaction as justification to elevate themselves. This is not exaggeration or moral labeling. It is the way a psychological structure without a stable core preserves itself, by ejecting what it cannot tolerate and placing it onto another person's emotional body. So when you leave in the manner of a structural disruption, as described in Part 2, what actually happens is not the loss of a loved one. What happens is that the shadow's drainage channel is cut off. Normally, the narcissist completes the cycle by framing you into a clear role: the betrayer, the weak one, the irrational one, the one who needs them, or the victim who makes them the hero. Once the framing is complete, they can retell the story in a way that keeps the persona intact. But when you leave too early, or you leave with sovereign silence, or you leave without arguing and without seeking to be understood, they cannot define you in the way they need. As a result, the shadow is neither fully expelled nor sealed off by the persona. It hangs suspended. It becomes a zone of interference. And this interference is what generates obsession. Here lies a crucial mechanism. When a narcissist cannot process an emotion consciously, they process it through repetitive behavior. You will see signs such as covert monitoring, checking, information gathering, reenacting scenarios, engineering accidental encounters, or hoovering. Observers often mistake this for missing you, still loving you, or still caring. But structurally, it is a desperate attempt to restore external regulation. They are trying to recreate an anchor point so the shadow has somewhere to discharge and the persona has something to lean on. When you do not respond, it becomes even more intolerable, because your silence is not merely a boundary, it is irrefutable evidence that you are no longer part of the mechanism. And when the one who once served as the pressure regulator disappears, the system begins to oscillate on its own. Jung had a chilling insight here. What is repressed does not disappear. It returns as fate, That is, if the shadow is not brought into consciousness and integrated, it will return as a compulsive repetition. A narcissist will not sit still, look into the void, and say, I am envious, I am ashamed, I am afraid of abandonment, or I am empty. They will do the opposite. They will create scenarios to prove that the fault lies with you, that you are still involved, that you are still being pulled, or that they can still rewrite reality. This is why their obsession rarely looks like gentle regret. It appears as belated control, as a need to close the book on their terms, as a need to provoke your reaction simply to feel powerful again. In short, they are not seeking you to return. They are seeking you to complete an unfinished psychological operation. And this is the most important analytical point for breaking the illusion. What makes a narcissist unable to let go is not you, but the fact that you became an unfixable error in their storytelling system. A narcissist must control the narrative for the persona to survive. If they cannot control the ending, they cannot control meaning, and if they cannot control meaning, they cannot control their sense of self. Your disappearance without providing a manipulable ending means you remove the ultimate privilege, the power to define reality. At that point, the shadow has nowhere to discharge outward and begins knocking from within. And for someone who survives by avoiding their inner world, that knocking feels like annihilation. From here, you can understand why some narcissists appear to have moved on with a new supply, yet remain haunted by you at a subterranean level. Not because they loved you more than the new person, but because the new person only helps them refurbish the persona, while the system error you left behind exists at a deeper layer, one the persona cannot reach. A new supply can provide noise and admiration, but it cannot erase the disruption that triggered the shadow's return. And when the shadow returns without being integrated, it produces a form of inner instability that they will try to extinguish in the only way they know, by provoking reactions from the outside. Part 4. Why the more new supply they have, the stronger the obsession becomes. Not because they haven't forgotten you, but because they are using the wrong function. One of the most dangerous illusions that causes those who have left a narcissistic relationship to doubt themselves is the image of the narcissist having someone new and looking very happy. On the surface, a new supply often appears to be proof that everything has been neatly replaced. A new face, a new story, a new stage. But when viewed structurally, a new supply is not a replacement, it is an attempt at patching a fault. And the more the surface is patched, the more visible the deeper fault becomes. The first thing that must be made clear is that a new supply is not chosen because they are a better match. They are chosen because they arrive at the moment the system is in panic. When you leave in a structurally disruptive way, the narcissist does not just lose a relationship, they lose an internal regulation mechanism. The shadow has been activated and has turned back onto the subject, while the persona no longer has the strength to maintain its form. A new supply appears as a quick fix, providing attention, admiration, novelty, and above all, noise. This noise temporarily prevents them from hearing the knocking from within. But a new supply can do only one thing: mask the noise, not repair the fault. They can feed the persona with positive reflection, but they cannot reach the site of disruption. Because what you left behind was not an emotional absence, but a break in the projection process. The new supply, who comes later, is simply placed into a familiar role, reflecting the ideal ego, confirming a new narrative, helping the narcissist present themselves as someone who has moved on, grown, or become happier. Yet this very rush to retell the story creates a paradox. The more they must prove that they are fine, the more they reveal that they are not. Here a subtle mechanism appears, one that few people notice: unconscious comparison. The narcissist may never say it aloud, may not even be fully aware of it, But every new supply is measured against an invisible standard. That standard is not you as a person, but the state of stability they once had before the system was disrupted. When a new supply fails to recreate that state, and they cannot, because that state depended on a projection chain that was severed, the narcissist begins to feel uneasy without knowing why. They have more people, more attention, more stages, yet less of the feeling I exist than before. And when quantity fails to produce quality, the system begins to leak. The more new supplies there are, the more refined the comparison becomes. Not in the sense of who is better, but in the sense of why that familiar feeling is not coming back. This is the point at which obsession increases rather than decreases. The narcissist does not return to you out of love. They return to the memory of a time when their system had not yet broken. But because they cannot admit this, they keep trying again with someone else. Each failed attempt causes the shadow to knock louder, because each failure is further evidence that the problem does not lie with the object, but with the structure itself. In this context, the new supply is being used for the wrong function. Instead of being a new relationship with a new reality, they are forced to attempt the impossible, to restore a state that has already died. When they cannot do so, they are either devalued, replaced, or pushed back into the old cycle. This explains why many narcissists appear to be constantly moving on, yet never truly stabilize. They are not living in the present. They are running in circles around a rupture they refuse to face directly. And here one thing must be made absolutely clear, so that the listener does not fall into a reverse illusion. The fact that a new supply cannot replace you is not because you are more special, but because you activated a process they were unable to complete. You were not the great love. You were the anchor that was removed. When the anchor disappears, every attempt at replacement merely stretches the rope elsewhere, causing the entire system to shake even more. That is why the more they display happiness, the more they project busyness, the more they showcase the new relationship, the higher the level of obsession at the subterranean layer. This is not a romantic script, but the reaction of a system trying to conceal its internal fracture. And when concealment no longer works, the narcissist begins to show very specific signs, not to return, but to confirm that the fault has still not been sealed. These signs are not loud or obvious, but if you look closely, you will recognize them as evidence that the new supply has not resolved the core issue at all. From here, the question is no longer, will they come back? But rather, how do you recognize that you yourself are the disruption they could never complete, even after moving through multiple relationships? And that is precisely where part 5 must be opened, not to inflate your ego, but to correctly locate the role you once held, and why not returning is the only act that truly ends the cycle. Part 5. Signs that you are the disruption they can never complete. At this point, one thing must be stated very clearly to avoid misunderstanding. Becoming the one they cannot let go of is not a title, nor is it a sign that you were more special or more deeply loved. In reality, it is not romantic at all, it is structural. And because it is structural, its signs do not resemble any familiar expressions of emotion. If you are still waiting for signs such as long messages, dramatic apologies, public jealousy, or emotional pleading, you will completely miss what is actually happening. The first and most important sign is that the narcissist never tells a complete story about you. With most other relationships, they always have a finished narrative. Who was right, who was wrong, whether they were the victim or the victor, why it ended, and what lesson they supposedly learned. With you, however, the story is always left unfinished. They either avoid mentioning you altogether, or they refer to you in fragmented, contradictory, illogical pieces. This is not because they do not remember, but because they cannot define your role within their familiar power script. You refuse to stay still inside a label they can control. The second sign is a silent, indirect presence. No words, no clear actions. Not returning, not direct contact, but peripheral movements. Watching from a distance, gathering information through others, accidentally appearing in places they know you will notice, or holding on to traces connected to you that they never fully resolve. This is not longing. It is an unconscious attempt to preserve a psychological anchor. When they cannot place you back into the system, they try to keep you in a state of not fully gone. Imasis. The third sign is more subtle and often misunderstood. You become a standard of comparison they themselves are not fully aware of. This does not show up as them saying, the new person isn't as good as you, but as recurring instability in subsequent relationships. A new supply may satisfy image, status, and admiration, but cannot recreate the state of stability they once had before the structure was disrupted. Each time that state fails to return, the shadow is activated a little more, and the system trembles another layer. You are not present as a person, but as an invisible reference point they cannot move past. The fourth sign is avoidance of direct contact with you, combined with an inability to erase you completely. Narcissists are usually very skilled at cutting people off once framing and devaluation are complete. With you, however, the cut is never clean. They may block you, go silent, appear indifferent, yet simultaneously cannot tolerate your total disappearance from their frame of reference. This is the paradox of a system error. The more they avoid facing it, the louder the shadow knocks from within. And because they cannot endure that knocking, they keep you at an ambiguous distance, not close, not far, not present, yet not gone. The final and most important sign for you to recognize does not lie in their behavior, but in your own state. When you truly are the disruption, you will notice something very strange. You no longer need validation. You do not need them to return to prove your worth. You do not need them to not let go to feel important. Because the moment you stepped out of the regulating role, you also stepped out of the game. What remains is not victory, but a clear stillness. You know you have exited an unhealthy structure, and not returning is the only way it no longer has power over you. This is where many people get confused. They believe that being the one a narcissist cannot let go of is a kind of win. In reality, it is merely a consequence. The real victory is when you no longer need to know whether they let go or not. When you understand that what they cannot release is not you, but an unresolved fault within themselves, you stop waiting for any external sign. And it is precisely then that the cycle truly ends, not with them, but with you. Part 6. The final truth. What they cannot let go of is not you, but the old self that has died. If we speak plainly, what a narcissist cannot let go of was never you. You were merely the point at which a structure came to a halt. What they cannot release is the version of themselves that once existed while that structure was still functioning. A self that borrowed strength from the outside, was continuously reflected, and had its emotions regulated without having to take responsibility for them. When you withdrew and did not return to fix it, that version of the self died functionally. And it is this death that the narcissist cannot tolerate. The crucial point here is this. Narcissists do not grieve in the way ordinary people grieve. They do not have a mourning process for a lost self. They lack the capacity to sit with collapse and reconstruct from within. So when the old self cannot be revived through you, they do not call it loss. They call it unfairness, lack of explanation, or unfinished business. But in truth, it is a self that no longer has an environment in which it can live. You need to understand this clearly so as not to fall into an illusion of power. The fact that they cannot let go does not mean you remain at the center of their world. On the contrary, it means you have exited that world. And it is precisely your refusal to return and re-enter the role that makes the structure impossible to restore. When you do not react, do not explain, do not argue, and do not seek to be understood, you cut off the only thing that allowed them to survive, the ability to place their psychological responsibility onto someone else. Here is a cold but necessary truth. You did not destroy the narcissist. You simply stopped carrying them. Any collapse, if it occurs, does not come from your actions, but from the fact that the structure cannot stand on its own without support. And because the narcissist has no inward path through which to be reborn, the old self can exist only as an obsessive memory, not as a living entity. That is why they may continue to live, continue to have relationships, continue to laugh and socialize, yet never return to the stability they once had. For you, the most important part of part 6 is not understanding them, but relocating yourself. You are not the one they cannot let go of. You are the one who is no longer there for them to let go of or to hold on to. The moment you no longer need them to remember you, no longer need their regret, no longer need their return to validate your worth, you have fully exited the system. And once you are outside the system, all of their remaining movements, whether monitoring, comparing, or constructing new narratives, no longer concern you. This is where the story ends in a way many people do not like to hear. There is no loud victory, no moment where they realize you were the greatest loss of their life. What ends is your participation, and that absence is the conclusion that cannot be edited. The narcissist cannot let go of the old self because they have no new self to replace it. And you do not need them to let go, because you have already let go of the role that allowed that self to exist. Part 7. The true ending, when you are no longer a person in their story. This final part is not for the narcissist. It is for you and for the moment that very few people recognize as the true ending of the entire cycle. Because this story does not close when they forget you, nor does it close when they let go. It closes only when you no longer exist as a psychological character within their frame of reference. This may sound abstract, but it is actually very concrete. Throughout the previous sections, you can see clearly. A narcissist does not attach to people, but to states. They do not obsess over those who stay, but over disruption. They do not suffer from losing you, but from losing a self that once functioned through you. So the final question is this: what happens when even the role of disruption is no longer being sustained by you? The answer is simple. The system loses its object of rotation. When you do not return, do not react, do not need to explain, and do not need to be understood, you do not merely leave a relationship, you exit their psychological operating axis. At that point, you are no longer the idealized figure, no longer the devalued one, no longer a memory for comparison, not even an unhealed wound. You become a formless absence, and that is the most dangerous thing for a structure that survives through projection. At a deeper level, a narcissist can process only two kinds of objects: objects to control or objects to oppose. But when you no longer participate in either pole, they no longer know where to place you. You are not an enemy to hate, not a lover to miss, not a victim to blame. You become an unlabelable void. And in depth psychology, what cannot be labeled cannot be manipulated. This is the moment many people misunderstand. They believe silence is a tactic. Not returning is a punishment, and living well is a way to show them. But if you are still doing any of these things with them in mind, you are still inside the system. The true ending arrives only when that motive disappears, when you are no longer doing anything for them, whether to retaliate, to prove something, or to reclaim power. You have exited the game at its root level. And here lies the greatest paradox. It is precisely when you are no longer special in the narcissist's mind that you become truly free. Because being remembered, not let go of, or becoming an obsession was never a reward. It was only a sign that you were once pulled into a structure with no exit for either side. Freedom does not come from whether they still think about you, but from the fact that your inner life no longer reacts to their movements. From a Jungian frame, this is the moment individuation truly begins. Not their individuation, because that would require facing the shadow they typically avoid, but yours. When you withdraw the energy of projection, when you no longer live in the role of the one who keeps the system from collapsing, you return that energy to the self. And when energy returns to the self, the question, do they let go, automatically becomes meaningless. After all of these analyses, perhaps the most important thing that needs to be put back in its proper place is not the question, has the narcissist let you go or not? But rather, why did you stay for so long to keep a structure that could not stand on its own, alive? When the question changes, the center of gravity shifts. And it is precisely there that real power moves. A narcissist does not hold on to you because of love. They are not obsessed with you because you are the one. What they cannot let go of is a version of themselves that could only exist when you were there to regulate, reflect, and carry the parts of themselves they could not tolerate. When you leave at the right moment, not in anger, not in retaliation, but through a decisive withdrawal from the role that structure exposes its bare truth. It was never an equal relationship, and it cannot survive without someone propping it up. This does not make you special in a romantic sense. It makes you awake, and that awakening is precisely what the system cannot tolerate. Because when you no longer need them to let go or to hold on, you have stepped outside the logic of control-reaction dependence that is the only foundation on which that structure operates. Therefore, the true ending of this story does not lie in whether they still remember you or have forgotten you, whether they remain obsessed or have replaced you. The ending lies in the moment you realize that being remembered is not a reward, and not being let go of is not a victory. The only victory is no longer having to live in a role that allows another person to exist at the cost of your own integrity. When you withdraw your energy back to the self, when you no longer participate in either pole of the game, love or hate, hope or resentment, the story closes on its own. No goodbye is needed. No climax. No moment in which the other person finally understands. Only one quiet fact is required. You are no longer there psychologically. And when that happens, the narcissist may continue living their life, and you begin living yours. Not as a memory inside someone else's system, but as a whole human being no longer held and no longer needing to be let go.